no one wanted to go in. No one liked the war, and when I got back, no one wanted to talk about the war. So it was this monumental experience for me, the whole process, that I couldn't really talk about with people. I thought by signing up on my own, it would somehow make me look better in the eyes of the Army. And I had just come through and passed a 2-year course in machine shop technology, and I thought for sure that they would use those skills and basically take advantage of it. And I was totally convinced that was going to happen. And so I signed up for 2 years. I could have signed up for 3 years and had the choice of a school that I could attend. And that would have set the tone for what I did for the next 3 years. But no, we all make choices, and I made the choice to go in for 2, thinking I knew better, and I didn't know better.
What was your basic track from the States to South Vietnam?
Went through Hawaii, then Wake Island, and then finally to Vietnam. The whole flight took about 15 hours.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking about what that was like, that flight there. One of the terms they referred to the airplanes, they called them freedom birds, but no one thought of that plane as a freedom bird as we were heading to Vietnam. It was, I had just got out of all of this training, and the training basically is teaching you all kinds of things: how to shoot every weapon, how to deal with officers, strategies for the Army. And so you're being bombarded with information and training. And by the time so when I finally got to the plane, it kind of was a point where you had the ability to contemplate what I had got myself into. And because at that point in time, I was fully trained. I had been going through all of this training, what it would have been 18 weeks preceding that. And so the experience on that plane over that 15 hours was just a very somber kind of experience, almost like sitting in a wake, in front of a casket and thinking of the quiet discussions that you have with people as you're in that room, because the elephant in the room was Vietnam. No one knew what it was going to be like. And there was an interesting mix of people basically on that flight. I think the ratio of infantry soldier to other type of skill set that was being sent to Vietnam, it might have been 12, 15 to 1. And so there was very few of us that were thinking about actually having to pick up a weapon and fight. Others didn't have to think that way. But I think all of us had the feeling of the unknown. What in heck were we getting ourselves into?
What are your first memories of arriving in Vietnam?
Well, the first memory of arriving there was when they opened the door of the plane, as they typically do as soon as it lands and comes to a full stop.
Yeah.
No one started to get up. There was no rush for the door. Everyone just sat there. And so the door remained open for a couple of minutes. And in that time, the smell of Vietnam is what came into that plane. You could smell vegetation. You could feel the heat. So just the air coming in meant, it just struck me that there was this monstrous change. I was experiencing something I had never experienced before. And then finally, some Air Force officer came in and welcomed us to Vietnam. And then we all got up and started walking out into the hangar area. And what I noticed out there was right from the start, everything seemed to be filthy and unkept and nothing like what you'd normally expect. It's kind of a letdown,
Mm,
and the whole experience after that was one letdown after another.
mm,
My feelings about Vietnam is I didn't want to be there, and I wasn't thinking too much about the politics of the war at all. I was just thinking about getting through this process, and getting back home again. We kind of thought of Vietnam as someplace that was not part of the world. It was almost like another planet.
mm,
And we thought of the United States as the world. As a matter of fact, we use that term all the time, going back to the world. We always talked about that, what it was going to be like when we got back to the world. And so if you're referring to the United States as the world, then what is Vietnam? And it was like Skull Island with King Kong or something. It was just a horrible
wow.
feeling, even though Benoit Air Force Base was surprising. I expected bullets flying when I got there, and it was just an Air Force base. It wasn't until later, that I got deeper and deeper into the Vietnam experience
Wow.
where bullets started to fly.
You say I didn't want to be in Vietnam. So then what was foremost in your mind? Just grit your teeth and get through it? How are you?
Strictly, strictly surviving the experience. I did not want to die, uh, and I knew I was heading into areas and places where I would be in danger, and so I wanted to basically watch out for myself as best as possible, not do anything rash, and do what it takes to get through it, and come out on the other side in one piece. That was my whole goal.
Did you have the experience of, as you're getting off the plane, having another group of military personnel waiting to get on the plane?
Yes, and that just ate everybody up, because as you were getting off and wondering what your year was going to be like and what your experience would be like, you were seeing basically a whole plane full of guys that were waiting to get on the same plane that you just departed from. And that was such a sick feeling,
Mm,
watching those guys, because they're all excited, and we're not excited at all.
wow.
All we can see is who knows what is coming. When I got to Fire Support Base Buttons, and I was assigned to a company called ASI, A Company, Second of the 12th Battalion, there was not a lot going on from the point of view of firefights. What it was is we were going to the field, looking for the enemy, basically. And the primary problem with experiencing all of that was living conditions. It was putting up with living in the jungle, for example, for 15 days at a time, without being able to take a shower. The only cleanliness you had out there was to be able to brush your teeth. You didn't have the water to wash your face. We used to carry 10 to 12 quarts of water, which would last us 3 days. And that's not enough water you needed that water primarily for drinking. And so you stayed dirty all the time. You never had the same uniforms ever. You were always picking up someone else's uniform and putting it on. And that's what you wore. There was the battling of the insects. The insects were a real pain to deal with, basically out in the jungle. Leeches, for example, during the rainy season, would be chasing you all the time. These land leeches would be they would had heat sensors on them, and they would pick up on your boots and start marching up your boot. We used to tuck in our pants so they couldn't get underneath the lower part of the pants you were wearing. So they'd crawl up your pants, and you kept looking down to see if you could spot them. And sometimes you could flick them off, and other times you didn't see one. It would go up under your shirt, bite you on the stomach, and that's when you knew. And so you'd reach under your shirt, yank the thing off, throw it away, and almost stick to your fingers. And so the leeches were bad. Mosquitoes are just mosquitoes. Termites were bad. Termites. We used to have to put like spray bug juice. We used to call it. It was a spray can of insect repellent, and you have to spray the area basically under where you're going to put your air mattress, or termites would actually poke a hole through your air mattress and let the air out. Then you'd be sleeping on the jungle floor. So the insects were a constant battle, the living conditions, and what we're expected to do out there.
And I think you write something about also when you go into the woods a little bit just to relieve yourself, that you would also spray a circle around that area as well. And it's not a pleasant topic, but I don't think I'd ever heard that before. Can you explain that, what that was about?
Yeah, what that was about, that was during the rainy season, basically, when the leeches that we were constantly battling, when you had to go out and take a dump in the jungle.
Yeah.
You did that with a shovel. You just went out, dug a hole, basically a shovel, and opened up a hole, pulled down your trousers, squatted over it, and did your business. And while you were doing that, these leeches, knew you were there, and so they're coming in at you. And so I can distinctly remember spraying a circle around myself, creating like a fence that they wouldn't cross. So as you're in this uncompromising position, they can't.
And we haven't talked about the Viet Cong or the NBA yet, but already you're describing a context that just sounds like a nightmare, and that sounds like you're under constant attack. And we haven't said anything about the VC yet. We haven't said anything about the NBA.
What was interesting about that is I think you tend to take on as a human being, you take on the burden that's put in front of your nose, and you tend to think that it's enormous at times, until you take on something that's even larger than that. And that's what it was like, basically, the first time I remember walking into a firefight. That made you forget everything. All the pain of not having a shower, or fighting insects, or eating sea rations, long range patrol packets, trying to pull guard at night. All of that drudgery went right out the window as soon as someone is trying to kill you.
Wow.
And that feeling didn't go away for the longest time. I'd come home, walk through the woods at times, and I would feel that, you know.
Feeling of something's after you.
Yeah, when another human being is hunting you as you hunt them, and they have the same similar rifles, that you're carrying, uh, just a very dangerous place to be. And you don't realize just how dangerous it is until it happens. And that's when it strikes like a thunderbolt that, my God, I could be killed out here. It's,
Mm.
uh, the first firefight, that where that happened was, we had a point man. Basically, when we walked anywhere, we walked single file in the jungle. And we probably had, we were maybe 5 yards apart, something like that. And so we were all strung out, and basically we're walking along, and you just get kind of lost in thought, the usual thing, of just putting up with being out there.
Mm.
And then all of a sudden an AK-47 opens up, and there was 5 to 7 rounds that came in at us, and that was it, just a burst. And I can remember after that, a guy screaming. And so it was the combination of those two shocks, and that's when you forget about all of the other pain you had. And that was the first experience of a firefight, which basically you had no idea. You guessed where those rounds came from, because the jungle was so thick, you just didn't see people. It wasn't like it was, I think, in World War II. And so everybody did their best to fire in that direction. That's when the officers step in and direct your fire, and we would just open up, and the medics had to go move forward, and find the wounded. And in this case, it was a guy by the name of Dave Bonzik. He was the one that ended up getting hit, and after the firefight, he was medevaced out, and I never knew what happened to Dave Bonzik. I didn't know if he lived or died until 2015, when I met him at the first reunion. And so that was the first experience of being in a firefight, and it was very typical. It was always an ambush. We'd be walking along, you wouldn't be thinking about those things, and then all of a sudden the world changes. When you were there as an infantry soldier, it was your job to do. And it wasn't your job to think about what happened to someone that just got hurt. As a matter of fact, you had a job. We had to continue on, and continue doing our job no matter what happened. And we were not offered the ability to find out what happened to someone that disappeared. So guys would come and go. Guys would come in on a helicopter, and they would be a new guy. Guys would leave after finishing their tour, and they would just disappear into oblivion. And it was different. I think the more current wars, like in Afghanistan and places like that, I think there was groups of people that went over as a group and came back as a group. And so you knew these people before you went, you worked with them there, and then you came back with them. Where in Vietnam, it wasn't like that. It was all done one person at a time. Someone would just show up and he'd be a new guy. Someone would leave, someone would get wounded or killed, and they would just disappear. Uh,
Wow.
and we had no way of, we didn't focus on people from the point of view of names and addresses and phone numbers. You know, we didn't have those things anyways. No one had cell phones, and so we were just all there to survive. And
Mm.
and so it was a weird thing how people just disappeared like that. And when I got back, I just wanted to forget about the whole process. So I didn't go tracking down anybody. Uh, the only effort I made to track someone down is when I got wounded and this guy Steve McCauley got killed. Uh, I had heard that he was called out as missing in action, and I knew that wasn't the case. He was never missing in action. So I tracked down his family.
As you were speaking, I was reminded of this strange reality where on Tuesday, I will put my life at risk to help the soldier next to me. And then on Wednesday, if that same soldier is hit and medevaced out, then I just let him go and move on.
Yeah, that,
It's a curious thing. I'll lay down my life for him, but if he's hit and gone, then to the extent possible, I'll then push him out of my mind and just keep going.
well, it was the job. The
Yeah.
job didn't stop when someone got hit. Basically, they got them out as quickly as possible, and then the job continued. You didn't have time. It was a 24-hour, 7-day job. It just never let up. There was no time to
Mm,
think.
yeah.
And even if you wanted to find out, there was no place to get the information. There was no internet. There was no one in the army willing to help you find out what happened to a particular person. Just didn't happen. I don't think the North Vietnamese in the field were interested in taking us on, and we were not interested really in taking them on. I mean, we put ourselves in the position to try to find them and root them out of the jungle. But I think from their perspective, they were not doing that. And so I think they avoided us an awful lot simply because we were such an overwhelming force. I mean, why would you want to take on a group, for example, that had 1,000 times the amount of firepower? Here you are in the jungle. You barely have enough to eat and get drinking water. I don't know what they carried. They were lucky to carry a rifle and probably 50 rounds of ammunition for all I know. They were not in a position, to take us on. So I think they avoided us a lot. Cambodia was different because Cambodia to them was a rear area. It's a place where they stored an awful lot of weapons caches and rice caches. And it's a place that President Nixon sent us in to disrupt them. It was part of the Vietnamization process.
Mm,
Where we being the U.S., were trying to pass the reins over to the South Vietnamese soldiers.
yeah.
And one way to do that was to disrupt them in Cambodia so they didn't have any supplies. And so their they were trying to protect their supplies, and that's why the intensity was so much greater in Cambodia. The crazy thing about war is the people fighting it on both sides don't really want to be there. You know, it's the politicians that put us into those positions. So we didn't want to go there. We, being an enlisted man, didn't want to go there and put ourselves in harm's way, you know, for what didn't seem to be any strong reasons. You know, along the same lines as stopping Hitler, for example, in Europe. And I think those Viet Cong soldiers felt in a similar way. We're all human beings, you know, and you know, maybe they were a bit more indoctrinated than we were, because I was really impressed with things out there with so little.
A very tenacious adversary, huh?
Very much so. In Cambodia, you know, I wrote about it, a number of things. You know, one of them, for example, that I wrote about was the bicycle trails. You know, as they brought rice down from North Vietnam, you know, to think that they would, you know, strap a couple bags of rice to each side of a bicycle and walk it down a jungle trail, you know, hundreds of kilometers to drop off 2 rice bags and then go back for more. You know, that's unbelievable. And I can remember a firefight where they had Cobra gunships basically shooting away, and you could hear in the background someone with an AK-47 firing back at that Cobra gunship. You know, that was mind-blowing to me, to think, you know, someone would step up like that. And so I just, they were in it for the long term. I think they had a different attitude than we did. And I think that's why they won out in the end. And I think the reason they won out in the end when we left is the South Vietnamese army. You know what I always felt every time I saw the South Vietnamese army, they were like posers to me. You know what I mean by a poser?
Yeah.
They always looked good in their uniforms, but I never got the impression that they were serious fighting units. I think they were basically riding on the backs of the United States.
Do you recall having that thought at the time? Like, if these guys aren't devoted to fighting for their own country, why should I be?
I can remember thinking that way. I think that's one of the reasons that we disrespected, you know, the South Vietnamese people to some extent. It's one of the reasons every time I ran across soldiers, we just didn't have any respect for them. And the same thing with people. I think the people, you know, we did some terrible things to the civilian population, not shooting them or anything, but from the perspective of disrespecting them. You know, like being in a bus where a guard on the bus was reaching out and taking hats off of people on motor scooters, pulling the bus over so they could reach the door and grab someone's hat. That's total disrespect. You know, one of the things I talked about was being in a latrine on fire support base buttons, and a little Vietnamese mama son comes in the door, you know, sweeping the floor, and I just picked up my feet.
Yeah, this is one of the
You know,
memorable stories.
I
Yeah,
mean, that's kind of like disrespect, isn't it? It's like I uh
her showing disrespect for you, like sweeping, and you're on the latrine. You've got to lift up your legs so she can sweep the area under you as you're sitting on the latrine.
as I'm sitting there. Yeah, it's and so we it was only some of the younger Vietnamese. That's where you would see people smile. I have some nice pictures of young kids, for example. Young kids always came across as different to me
Mm,
than the adults. I never got a sense that the adults appreciated what we were doing for them.
mm,
But I think young kids are always interested in soldiers, and because we always have something to give them.
mm.
It might be a piece of candy or something.
You say that at a point in the war, you picked up a new motivation. There, you've described, a primary motivation is just to survive, to make it through my tour here and get out. Um, but you do write about a point where you pick up a new motivation, and that is revenge, the
Hmm.
motivation of revenge. And you hear a lot of combat vets talk about this, so it's not unique to you. Um, can you share what that event was that led to that additional motivation? Um, and then, how that played out then from that point forward. What was
Well,
it that caused that change in you?
I think when you're trained to be an infantry soldier, you're being trained to kill people. But I think the only people that have the natural, let's say, inclination to do that are psychopaths. But there's only a sprinkling of those guys, even though I think you did find them. I think they gravitated to the infantry. And so it takes a different motivation to get someone to act. One of them might be if someone takes a swing at you, then you're going to swing back. If someone shoots at you, you're going to shoot back. So that's one sense. And then where revenge comes in is when not only do they shoot, but they seriously hurt someone or even kill someone that you knew, and that's when you're thinking an eye for an eye, and your whole way of it took that to drive you over the top, and I think to want to kill, basically. Because I don't think as I said, we don't naturally do those things.
Mm.
Uh,
Did you
unless you
earlier in the discussion you used the phrase, the Viet Cong were hunting us and we were hunting them. But as I'm reflecting on what I've heard thus far, my impression is that when you arrived in Vietnam, you weren't particularly interested in hunting anybody. You were interested in not being the prey of the VC, of surviving their hunting expedition. But it sounds like what happened um, triggered something in your own mind now that you did become, in some sense, a hunter as well. Now it's not just I want to not be hunted. Of course, I still don't want that, but I am more motivated now to go hunting, if I can
well,
use that
let me talk about
language.
the hunt.
Yeah.
No infantry soldier wanted to go into the field hunting Viet Cong. That came from the officers. That came from the planners, who had goals. So if Army brass, for example, thought that this particular area in Vietnam had a concentration of Viet Cong soldiers, it was the Army brass that would tell the foot soldiers, in effect, along with the officers, that that managed them to go to those places. It's not like we wanted to do those things. We were forced to do those things. You know, we were being forced by upper echelon officers, and it was all the process of fighting, basically. You know, where the officers who were not in the middle of the fighting themselves, I think they naturally find it easier to send someone into harm's way than the people who actually go into harm's way. You know, no one wanted to go out there. You know, no one wanted to do the things that we were forced to do. We were ordered to do it, and as soldiers, we were trained to follow orders, and it was that simple.
Yeah.
So, and so where the revenge part came in is as you were being pushed to go out there and do these things, your attitude about it changed as we had people hurt, when you had friends that were hurt. And then you had this sense of revenge. But I think the preference was not to go out there at all. When Steve was wounded, he ended up getting very badly wounded, and that evening died basically in the jungle. And I was wounded at that time, and when I got wounded, my whole attitude changed, because all of a sudden I felt vulnerable, where I hadn't felt that way before. I was more aggressive. I can remember looking at guys that were not aiming their rifle, for example, but were just holding it up and firing it and hidden down. And so there was a feeling that I had that changed dramatically when I got hit. And after that, I just had no interest in being out there, and I was going to do whatever I could to keep myself alive, basically.
Yeah. If I remember right, you're wounded. Is it a mine that blows when you're out on a trail or something like that?
It was a booby trap. I never knew what it was, but they said it was like a large artillery shell that had never exploded, and the Viet Cong had put a blasting cap in it, and then connected. The blasting cap had come from a hand grenade, and so there's a ring associated with that, and so you can tie a vine to that ring, and so if you trip it, you know, the blasting cap goes off basically, and the artillery round explodes, and they seem to think that's what it was. That I can remember stepping over the vine, looking down. You know, this was in Cambodia, and it was just, you know, that they were doing things like that to us. It was constant pressure, constant fighting. We were doing so much fighting, you couldn't get resupplied with food and water as often as you wanted. And so I ended up stepping over this vine, and I think Steve McCauley was behind me, and I don't know if he tripped it or what, but all I know is it exploded and totally changed from that point forward how I felt about the war and my own ability to stay alive.
You're wounded. I believe another soldier's wounded, and then Steve is very seriously wounded, and then dies later in the day.
Yeah, Steve died later that night. There was another guy by the name of Wade Blair who got wounded in an ankle, and so Wade Blair and myself ended up on a medevac along with Steve, went back to the hospital, and Wade Blair was lucky enough. He had a $1 million wound. You know, if you got wounded in a bone, it was a lot more dangerous. And so he was lucky enough to go home with that wound. And Steve wasn't lucky enough. And I was given a job on a fire base while recovering. And I decided I was going to stay on that fire base as long as I possibly could. I just had no interest in going back out in the jungle again. I remember walking along, and the next thing I know, I had this sense of flying through the air, and I'm on my face. And I'm feeling like I smell the explosive. So I kind of had a sense of what happened. You know, it's like being blindsided, you know, by anything. It's like if you were driving a car down the road, and a car came out of nowhere and hit you, and you didn't see it coming. You know, boom, like that, and everything changed. And so I just remember feeling, you know, checking myself to see if I still had 2 legs and 2 arms. I didn't know how badly I had been hurt. And so it took, you know, 2 or 3 minutes before I realized, gee, maybe I can get up. And because until then, I was just lying there. I mean, everybody was in shock after that. You know, something like that is just unbelievably devastating. Yeah, and so it turned out I could walk, and I was just so thankful for that. You know, not everybody is as lucky as I was.
And how long were you in the hospital then, recovering?
Uh, Not long. I basically, you know, I had shrapnel in the back of my legs, still there. They sometimes they choose never to remove those things. It's more dangerous to remove them than to leave them. So it's still there, and I was in a hospital for maybe 2 or 3 days, and then I was bandaged up, and I kind of limped, you know, back. I couldn't freely walk. I was plenty sore, and I think my neck had got wrenched as well in the process. So ended up going to the fire base, and they let me rest and do what I could there for a job. You know, they ended up putting me in a supply tent area, and I started doing that while I was recovering from it.
And you describe in what you write, as time goes by and, you know, as you've recovered a bit, you describe, you know, pain in your legs and that, but as time goes by, you know, you seem to be in better shape. And these conflicted feelings that you have, on the one hand, you know, there's that sense of, you know, I've made a I've made a contribution. I've seen a lot of fighting in Cambodia. I can say I've done my part, and I was wounded, and here now I am on this base, and I've got this relatively nice job on a base, and that's great. But then there's also this other side that said, you know, but maybe I should go back out and be with the guys, out in the jungle, sort of that conflicted feeling. Do I have that right? That sense of conflict in your own mind?
Well, it was. It weighed on me an awful lot, because I did feel guilty not being out there with the guys when I felt like I could go back,
Yeah.
and and that conflicted with my need to want to stay alive. I I didn't want to I didn't want to do something stupid. I kind of set myself in motion that way when I got to Vietnam, deciding that I wasn't going to put myself into any crazy positions. I was going to try to keep myself alive, do the job, but try to stay alive and get out of there in one piece. And so that was the conflict. You're with a bunch of guys for a long time. They're still out there, still in Cambodia. Even though Cambodia kind of ended about 3 weeks after that. And no one was coming to me. No doctor was coming to me. None of the officers were coming to me and asking me if I wanted to go back out again. And I just wasn't about to go to an officer and say, listen, I think I'm ready. I want to go back out and put myself in harm's way.
Yeah.
So
Now,
I just didn't want to do that.
they do eventually send you back out, right?
I did. I had to. They eventually reached a point where they looked at me and they needed a sergeant. By that time, I had made sergeant. I made rank very quickly in Vietnam. And they were looking for a squad leader in the field and realized, gee, Dick Udine is sitting out there. We can't get people. Let's put them back out there. And so they made that decision to put me back out there, and I just went along with it. I didn't like it, but I went along with it.
A very small number of combat veterans will speak of combat with a kind of relish. It was something that for them was thrilling, and that was pretty much it. That's a very small number. The majority of combat veterans describe combat as something that's horrible, terrible, and yet there's also there's something that's kind of awesome about it, that as time goes by you kind of miss. You kind of miss that adrenaline, and you miss that intensity. And then there are some vets who say, no, combat's just terrible and there's nothing awesome about it whatsoever. I'm kind of putting you, as I'm listening to you, into that latter category. Am I right about that?
I think I'm being honest about it.
Yeah.
Like one thing I could never understand is why someone would go back for another tour. I would never have done that. And so when I hear people like that return for a second tour, I think either they didn't have my job, or they're a psychopath of some kind.
Yeah.
That enjoy that stuff. But that wasn't me.
Did you meet any of these soldiers who really loved being out there, and who loved, to use the word we were using earlier, who loved the hunt? And
There was I wrote about a guy. There was a sergeant soon after I got out there. He was a lifer, and we had found some graves out in the jungle, and we were asked to dig up the graves because there could be weapons buried with them, and so we had to do those things. And I just remember I remember, some guys out there carried these big Bowie knives with them, and I just remember him picking around with a Bowie knife, in a grave, and I just thought, God, what's the matter with this guy?
How would you say that the Richard Udine who goes into the army in August '69 is different from the Richard Udine who is out of the army 2 years later with this experience in Vietnam? Or I guess the better way to put it would be is how is that Richard Udine of 1971 different from that Richard Udine of 1969 as a result of that year in Vietnam? How did that experience change you? What lifelong impact did it have on you?
We're just much more serious. I grew up there. You know, if you look at the early pictures of me, like there's an early picture of me standing by one of those freedom birds, where I'm kind of holding a weapon like this, and if you look at my face, there's an innocence in it that's not there in later pictures. And so I think going through that kind of pain in your life changes you, makes you a more serious person. So I was no longer kid-like anymore,
Mm.
and so I think I was better off for it. When I came back, you know, I went back to school. Uh, I was more focused on what I wanted out of life. So I think all in all, the experience in that respect was a good one.
You've said that from the outset, Vietnam was not something that you wanted to do. Flying there, the feeling of, you didn't use the word dread, but something like that. You're there, and your inclination at the beginning is not, I wonder what this adventure has in store for me, but just get through it. Um, the experiences you've described, and there's a lot, we could have talked about that we didn't, all of the combat you saw especially in Cambodia. Um, and just the strong impression that comes through is that, Vietnam was not a place you wanted to be. It wasn't a place you were glad to be in. Um, and then if I have it right, you said this early on, when you came home, there was the feeling that no one cared, no one was interested. So let me just pause real quick. And was that your perception after your year in Vietnam when you came home, that whatever was going on with the protests, that your experience was that people just weren't very interested in hearing about what you had done or what you had seen?
Well, there was protesters out there, but it wasn't my friends that were protesters. All I was interested in was getting back with the group of guys, that I used to hang around with before I had gone in the service for 2 years. And they were not really interested in hearing about what I had done. Vietnam was, in my mind, in one sense, was this monstrous accomplishment. Just getting through it, and but they were not interested in those details, and so I just didn't talk about them anymore, and so it kind of disappeared from my life. And then the reunion kind of came out of nowhere, and that was a tremendous shock as well. It was almost like meeting those guys in 2015 was, it hurts. That's kind of what it did to me. Couldn't speak. I think all that hidden emotion just came out through them.